Graduated, elevated, now it's my time to shine, yeah, let's go. Graduated, elevated, now it's my time to shine, yeah, let's go. Major moves, power moves.
Welcome to PhD Hard Talk, Nikunj. Could you please introduce yourself, what you do, and where you are in terms of your research journey, and hopefully we can crack on with our research. And thank you for coming back again and being a guest on PhD Hard Talk.
Well, thank you for the kind invite and for asking me to come back. And thanks to the reviewers who have loved and asked for a second round of my talk. So to introduce myself to the viewers, my name is Nikunj Kulshreshtha. I am a assistant professor of law at Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal Global University. My research interests are criminal law, comparative criminal law, and interdisciplinary approaches such as gender and sociology to law. So currently, in terms of my journey, I'm into the final phases of writing a couple of papers and getting them published so that then I could move on to my PhD applications and master's applications from this year on. So that is all about me. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I know you've sent in your abstract and we've touched on it in our previous discussion, and I would like to delve a bit more and hopefully get to the application process and, in terms of PhDs, masters, the differences and how one should conduct themselves during that process. Because in the previous video, we've, we touched on that and we had a lot of questions and people were able to watch your video and learn from the processes that you employed. So thank you very much for sharing kindly before. So in terms of rape law in India, could you take us through that? Because in terms of understanding, what does it look like? Is it fit for purpose? And then we can crack on.
So essentially, the sexual assault law in India, or the rape, offense of rape, as it's called, is still a gender law in India. So only women could be victims and males could be perpetrators for the purposes of the law. We have a colonial law which deals with sexual violence towards other genders or people, non-binary, transgender persons, and others. But the language of the law is essentially shrouded in let's say Christian morality, as it was one of the how should I put it, the influences for the law at that time. So the offense is called offenses against public nature, and it is termed in a manner which is very offensive in terms of it is a sexual intercourse against the order of nature. So essentially, it was about keeping checks on non-reproductive sexuality. That was the essential idea behind enacting those sections. Now, the law in India, with respect to gender specificity, has received a lot of criticism, considering that it does not protect adult male members and non-binary victims out there. And there is a growing, let's say, wave of change of these laws. So Pakistan recently has introduced a gender-neutral sexual assault law. So is the case with the there's a provision for custodial violence against males in Nepal. There is something going on, recognition of domestic violence as well as sexual assault in Bhutan, in Sri Lanka. So in all of South Asia, regions which could say that their social legal cultures is more relevant to the Indian setup is essentially going on. And I'm working currently on a paper critically analyzing the arguments against gender inclusivity in sexual assault law in India, and hopefully plan to present it at the National University of Singapore conference at the end of May, at the Asia Law Institute conference. So hope to get some good comments there.
Oh, wow. We're both going to be in Asia at the same time. I'll be in Bangkok.
Oh, that's really nice to hear.
Amazing. Congratulations on your paper as well. So before we divert and go into our casual discussion, I've seen with Bollywood in terms of the doc series that they have, they are pushing for an agenda for change. I've seen documentaries in terms of abuse of individuals in the LGBTQ community, and also how their parents perceive the abuse and how their parents behave when the community is against that individual. And I've also seen whereby I think there's a docuseries. She is at the top. She's a senior detective, and she's looking at the rape cases, and there's a girl who was raped on a bus. So in terms of education, I think Bollywood is trying to do their best. But in terms of your take, because I'm not in India, this is just further research I was looking into to see how the media is pushing the agenda for change. What's your take on that? Does it help, or does it just box people into different boxes to say, do you know what, that's happening, it's fine, it's okay, it's entertainment, it's on TV? What's your take on that?
So I would say media is definitely a very powerful medium for, let's say, disseminating information, creating cultural stereotypes. And it's really good that you brought this up, because one of the major improvements that we're having, or tussles, as they say, we're having in the law, is with respect to the recognition of marital rape in India. So that's not a crime as of now. And this is where, the importance of media becomes very important, because I could literally, because I'm working on some research projects related to, Bollywood movies, documentaries, cannot think of a single movie where marital rape was actually depicted. Now you have to understand that that is what, creates the average person's mind, that if I have not seen this crime, and if it's not ever, portrayed before me, the chances of it actually existing seems little mythical, if you get it from that perspective. And I mean, Bollywood and other people are definitely trying to push the, let's say, notion that male victims tend to face certain kinds of domestic as well as sexual violence. But I feel that the gender norms and the social conditioning is so ingrained in society that it's very difficult to essentially rechange them. I think sharing a very personal story from my childhood might be very relevant for you to understand a lot of issues in India. So, and I'll try to as much be brief about it. So I remember going to these birthday parties I had as a child, so there used to be a birthday party, all the kids from the neighborhood were called. And I remember seeing a very particular caricature in every household. So the father of the child was never part of the festivities, in the sense that they were in a corner with their friends, either eating, playing merry, basically uninvolved in the parties, assisting the mother. The mother repeatedly was, toiling hard in the kitchen, at best with one domestic help or a sympathetic friend. And can you imagine? They were serving 30 kids. And imagine teenagers with around 10, 12 years and three full rounds. So the first round will be cake and pastries and, chips and snacks. Then another round of a full course Indian meal cooked from scratch. Then the third round of ice cream and other things. Then return gifts to the kids. So imagine the management of those 30 kids alone by one or two individuals. And I remember that after noticing this same scenario playing out in two, three households, I suddenly decided to help those, mothers. So if she would give me a glass of soda, I'll pass it on to the other kid. I would distribute plates among the kids, random things. The other kids, when they saw me doing this, they questioned me about it, that why are you doing it? So I said that the poor woman is working really hard and it wouldn't really hurt us to help her. They weren't convinced. They said that we are not servants and we are here to have fun and it makes no sense. I didn't listen to them and I continued. When they could not convince me with arguments, they started mocking me. That, oh, here comes a servant in all other parties. And due to this name calling over a period of time, I stopped doing it. But years later, when I reflected on this small incident, the thing is, at that age, I was like 10, 12 years old. I was not helping those women out of some sense of, gender equality or feminism. I was just doing it because I saw somebody working hard. It was as natural as it could come. And the fact that 12 years old had this ingrained thought of, gender roles and dignity for labor, it's like you can imagine the, Herculean task of dealing with the, people at much later ages, when at such young age they had such restricted norms of understanding things. So I would say that is one big area where I feel that society needs to change first before we could move anything forward.
Thank you very much for sharing a personal story. And I think it goes back to culture, like you said, in terms of the changes, in terms of the cultural norms. But then, there's something that you mentioned initially, which was rape within marriage. that we don't really see it in movies. And then I've just sat here and I'm reflecting on what you're saying and I'm hearing you. It is actually true. We don't see it as a crime and we wouldn't really necessarily view it in that way because it's something that's shared behind closed doors. And if somebody was to say it, in terms of culture, there'll be that pushback to say, oh, it happened, it's something, we'll talk it out and resolve it. So in your opinion, how does, the media help to get that message out there to say, actually, it is a crime and it is wrong. And if somebody does not give consent, it means no, literally do not touch.
Well, I believe then in that situation, I think the situation of consent is far more complex than we would imagine. I recently wrote a paper analyzing the standard of consent on that regard, where I talked about the different situations in which consent could become problematic. So when you talk about it in this context of marital rape, between spouses and others, I think the first thing that would need to done is to break down the concern of the law. So, the legal concern has to be from community to an individual. Only when we bring it down to an individual, we will be in a position to, enforce individual rights. Because as long as we work with the community mindset, it's like, as you said, it becomes a closed doors behind problem and resolve it with, let's say, counseling and elders intervening and things like that, rather than a crime, which is what is appropriately designated. So that is where I feel that there is a major issue where the law, I think, has limited reach. And I think the sexuality education, consent education, and those cultures would be far, those methodologies will be far more effective in changing people's opinions than the law, I would say, per se.
No, thank you very much for explaining. So, in your opinion, if you had to speak to some of the biggest Bollywood directors right now, because I think they've got influence because I've seen these reality TV shows as well. It's actually a big industry based on what I've found on the internet. What would you pitch to them to say in regards to education when it comes to consent? Because they can write these scripts and it can get out there a lot quicker than us trying to change a bill or sitting down with policy writers. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say that they would need to sensitize themselves to the different sexualities, to the different situations, to the underlying reality of the rapes. And since we are talking about this, I can maybe talk about a research that I was specifically doing. A couple of my team is currently on this research. So we are doing a survey of Bollywood movies from 1980s to till about 2022 to understand the construction of rape as a crime depicted in movies. And what we essentially saw in those movies was it's a little unfortunate, the facts that we found out that the depiction of rape is always a physical act, a man overpowering a woman, her shouting, and because that leads to an ideal victim caricature in the minds of the, let's say, the people, the justice machinery, the judges. So I feel that if I have to talk to those directors, I would say that you need to do some ground research, some empathetic understanding with policymakers, with let's say counselors of rape victims, to actually understand what happens out there before portraying something with a half-baked knowledge. I think that's a little insensitive, not to mention hurtful to the larger interests of society. I think that's just what the message I would like to give them.
That's quite interesting. So I've got a bit of a curveball. I watched a few. Well, I didn't watch them in great detail, but in the dances, some of the dances, they were quite what's the word I'm looking for? They're linking into Hollywood a lot more. I'll put it that way. And the clothing as well. When we say we've got a pandemic in regards to rape cases, but then I'm watching these dancings and how some of the women were shaking, what their mama gave them, essentially, when they're protruding and, they're doing all sorts. I was quite confused because, we're fighting against something, yet we're still sexualizing women. In terms of the dances, the clothing, they had pum shots and everything. And I was set, I knew we had this chat, so I was just analyzing everything. And also there were certain TV shows as well that I came across whereby, because you said you've looked at, you know, from the 80s to 2022, there were also other movies there where they were quite very sexual. I was quite shocked because I expect that of Hollywood. You know, in terms of people being naked on screen and we seeing, you know, buttocks and, you know, breasts. But then I was quite shocked for me to see that in Bollywood. What's your take on that? Because we're saying we're fighting against rape, we're educating people. What's your take?
I just feel that we are. I think there's a general trend of copying the West in certain ideas with the assumption that they tend to generally sell. And I also feel that there's generally this increase without analyzing the context. You know, we find you're copying something, somebody has done something, so you could, you know, take inspiration from it, but without understanding the cultural, let's say, context. And plus, I don't know if you would essentially relate to me on this one, but I think there is generally an increase in a lack of people regulating private space. I would say, you know, people announcing every detail of their lives on social media and other things. I think there's a growing trend out there. Like it's like, you know, you have to announce everything out there. I mean, I think that is essentially a thing to certainly bother. I mean, something that is really affecting our society generally. But when you say that, you know, uh, the movies generally are having a disproportionate impact, I'll give you a good example that I think you will be able to relate to very much. And I think because we need our screenwriters and editors to involve people from other genders and sexualities to understand that. I think the cisgender heterosexual male doing everything could be a problem, and that's why I said I'll give you a very good example in this one. So these sanitary pads, right? When they are marketed out, I don't know about the advertisements in the UK, but in India, there's a trend of these women portrayed as jumping and dancing and doing, like, let's say, being super women, right? So the thing is, and the reality is that stomach cramps, menstrual cramps can be really bad for women, and it tends to have adverse effects on your health, on your moods. But the way it is portrayed on screen by these, you know, writers out there, you do realize that why is it that some men feel that women use, let's say, you know, periods as an excuse for X, Y, or Z, or they tend to form opinions that leaves during menstrual cycles is unnecessary. So are you understanding where is it essentially coming from, that kind of process? It's the portrayal of these, you know, actors on screen during, let's say, menstrual cycles as, you know, superwomen. I think that's a problem. That's a good example of how problematic the portrayal can be at times. So
I think I'm going to agree with you because our advertisement is quite similar. I think we've got a lady who does ice skating. And she's
yeah,
like, since I started using this pad, I can literally do anything I want. And she goes on the ice, she twirls, lifts up her leg, and she's like, I feel amazing, I'm brand new. And then we've got other adverts as well that actually show the blood, and they're like, oh, there was a stigma towards the blood, and this is where we are. So I do understand in terms of the way, I think this leads us to diversity and inclusion.
yeah,
Which
yeah.
you've touched on. You know, if the screenwriters don't experience what the other person experiences, it becomes a movie, really, it becomes Hollywood. And
Yeah.
essentially is problematic. So, you know, in terms of your research then, linking into identifying the research gap in this new research paper, not the abstract that we're discussing, how did you identify the research gap?
So I essentially read a lot of literature because my paper, critical analysis of the standard of consent and rape law in India, is comparative with UK and Canada. So I have involved three different jurisdictions. I have understood how it has been analyzed, and what I've essentially understood is that the law has very limited reach in certain situations, which could be tricky for lawmakers to deal with. You know, just so you know, I could give a very quick example. So there are teenage boys and girls above the age of, let's say, their boyfriend, girlfriend, above the age of, let's say, consent, and the girl wants to wait a couple of years before, you know, giving consent for sex. but the boy threatens that he would move on to somebody else, or she feels that way even if the boy doesn't and consents. Now in these situations, for the purpose of law, for the purpose of legal consent, consent does exist, but
Right.
in reality it's not fully there, right? So these are that's an example of complex situations which are not envisaged nor the lawmakers can deal with. So
Can I
which is
interject on that? So, do you think the onus is on the parents to educate their children to say if someone says, I want to wait, or if somebody says, I want to go ahead, you should be able to say no and keep your dignity intact and move on? What's your take on that?
I'm very much in favor, but I would not just put the burden on the parents. I would say society, schools, colleges, universities, because what you have to understand is that a lot of these, as I said, those kids who were insensitive to my understanding of, gender relations at that age, they are full-grown men now. So you would have to target them in their offices for gender sensitization. So I'm just saying you have to understand the quantum of the problem and the solution. So you have to start right down from the new kids in schools all the way up till, let's say, retirees who are at the end of their working life, 50s, 60s, everything at the workplace. Only then we might have some sort of movement. I mean, I would put the onus on everyone.
Okay. So like in the UK, we do have sex education for year threes and year fours. I believe they'll be about 6 or 7 years old,
Mhm.
and they do watch a video of a man and a woman, and they will, explain in terms of if they get together, the egg and the sperm, then a
Yeah, yeah.
baby 9 months later, will come about, and that now they've introduced for the LGBTQ plus community in regards to if a man and a man or a woman and a woman do sleep together, this is the reality, if that makes sense. So they get to
Mhm.
watch those videos and it educates them in terms of where we are, nine binary terms, etc. They, she, he, you understand where I'm going.
Yeah, of
So,
course.
you know, you're saying we should start at the core, but I think it's really confusing for a child because I can't see myself sat there and I am watching mom and dad, and then I see mom and dad. There's a lot computing in my head,
Mhm.
you know, but that's just me saying that. I'm not saying that's how everybody is. What's your take on that? Because you've compared the UK, Canada, and India in regards to your paper.
So I would say that I can understand that it may be a little, I don't know how, because see, in every society, kids mature based on the society functions. So I remember having the reproductive, let's say, study in eighth grade. So we had it quite late, that is there. But I would say at least having that conversation at a young age, I think is appropriate anyway, because despite the confusion, it will give a time for adults to essentially, address the topic rather than beating around the bush. Because I do see a lot of parents finding it uncomfortable to essentially deal with this topic. And I feel that is one of the reasons why we have slippery slope conversations in public. I think dealing with the issues and talking out loud, with very clear understanding of what's what, I think that would really help our society generally and the child as well.
So, right. So now the issue goes back to the parents. So the parents are not confident to speak to their children about, sex essentially.
Yeah.
So do you think that maybe the parents need to go to school? Because, if you have children, would you be more comfortable for you to be the one to express and explain to say, this is what happens, an egg and a sperm, and they touch. Sometimes the baby might not come, sometimes the baby might come in 9 months, or it might be a stillborn baby. Do you think that's a better message being relayed by a parent than in school? What's your opinion on that?
I think parents definitely would have to play a supporting role, but I think it is culturally sensitive to not push. That's what I'm saying, to push the entire burden on the parent, because they could also be culturally born and brought up in a way that it's difficult for them to have this conversation. Which is why I'm saying that at any avenue the child could get to essentially have those conversations would really help out there. And I'm really glad that this kind of LGBTQ education is happening, because apart from the biological route, the let's say adoption of children, all of those things will eh, essentially help our society move into a more inclusive way. So it's essentially good out there. So as I said, as many people as they could essentially talk about it, that helps.
Thank you very much for your response. So moving on to your research then, I think you've touched on it. How does it help the community?
So we have, as I said, that there is a general movement towards gender inclusivity in sexual assault laws in all of South Asia and globally as well. My research generally is going to be about the idea that the more we move away from a gendered understanding of sexual assault, let's say a very sexualized understanding of how it portrays, the easier it is going to be to reduce the myths and assumptions regarding what took place in a sexual assault, and the easier it is going to be to focus on it as a crime in itself and not the stigma around it. I think that's the major contribution. It's like I firmly believe that there's an issue of sexual violence out there, and if we fight it all together, all genders, no genders, non-binary individual, everyone, it will help us focus on the issue at hand rather than the other issues that we are having, that okay, who deserves more attention, who does not, and what kinds of sexual assault is more problematic than others. I think the conversation needs to be much more broader in that sense, more than being restricted to, let's say, a gendered understanding, or let's say a sexualized understanding. I think that's what the larger conversation should be.
I like that, but then I've just had a thought. With prisons, we've got people that have been put into prison for allegedly raping somebody, and they didn't. So do you think also we need some restorative work in the prisons in regards to education around rape? Because also we do hear some stories to say people have been raped in prisons because they raped somebody outside, and people are like, oh, we're going to then deal with you or manage you to say you raped a child or you raped a woman, so we're going to rape you instead to get you back for what you did. What's your take on that?